Metal Gear may not have been the first stealth game, but it certainly was the one which would popularise the nascent genre. Looking at what came before, with Muse Software's Castle Wolfenstein and its follow-up personally coming to mind when I think about stealth games, it's interesting to see the evolution it would apply to the genre in becoming its breakout star. Whilst the original MSX version is going to be the main focus of this review, it isn't where my own experiences started out. That was when I saw an advert for the C64 version all the way back in 1991. I still remember that advert fondly from the back cover of an issue of Run magazine. The stark white background, littered with images of weapons and equipment you could use. And then that little description of the gameplay making it sound so darn awesome. But really, that was that. I never saw the C64 version for sale, and none of my C64 owning friends did either. It wouldn't be for quite a few more years until I'd be once again reminded about this game, and of course, the important factor, that it originated on the humble line of MSX computers, and was kind of one of those games that triggered a near 20-year lust to get a proper copy and to play it on a real machine. Metal Gear is set in the near future of 1995, with reports of a weapon developed by an enemy force operating from outer heaven, a fortress deep within Africa. In response, the Special Forces unit Foxhound sent in their top operative Grey Fox, and prior to losing contact with him, received one final message reporting of something named Metal Gear. It's now down to Foxhound's newest member, codenamed Solid Snake, to infiltrate outer heaven, locate Grey Fox, find out just what Metal Gear is, and stop it. Something which certainly sounds like an easy task for a well-equipped soldier, right? Not when Snake is deployed with nothing but his bare fists, a transceiver to call up home base, and, like any 80s action hero, a pack of cigarettes. Weapons, equipment, those are all found in the field, either scavenged from enemy soldiers, or hidden away in rooms and trucks across the fortress. After your initial on-site briefing, you're free to start exploring and making progress through the base. This initial area is pretty well designed. There's only a few rooms that you need to go through, and you'll quickly learn the basics of avoiding enemy patrols, locating keycards for opening restricted areas, and finding some of the various items you can pick up. Each room within can be considered a bit of a puzzle, working out the best way to cross it without being spotted by guards, cameras, or even attack dogs. Eventually, you'll be able to time it to clear enemies out, but early on though, that isn't really an option, as ammo is scarce, and Snake just can't take a lot of hits before dying in battle. Fixed layouts for these screens may mean it's tough when backtracking, and yes, there is plenty of it in this game. But one design tweak I really appreciated to ease the pain: when entering some rooms, the positions and patrol routes of the guards vary. It's not much, but this reduces the chance of having an alert go off immediately on entering a screen. Another little trick in Snake's inventory is the humble cardboard box. When this is equipped, you'll be practically invisible, providing you don't move. So, by moving in short bursts when the guards can't see you, you can move through those tricky regions sight unseen, like a true master of stealth. Eventually, you'll run into some of Outer Heaven's heavy hitters, the bosses located at various points in the facility. Consisting of both crack soldiers, as well as some very high-powered military equipment, they're certainly not quite as straightforward to take down as your normal cannon fodder soldier. In fact, a successful takedown requires not just the right weapon, but also knowing the tactics to survive their movements and their own attacks as well. Weapon-wise, when you're tired of punching out guards, you can start to use the weapons you'll accumulate from across the base, at least once you find ammo for them. These range from pistols and submachine guns, both of which can be upgraded with a silencer, which are great for dealing with most of the guards. Then there's the heavy hitters: grenade launcher, rocket launcher, along with mines and plastic explosives, which are used for when you need that bit more punch. or when dealing with some of the vehicles. Finally, there's the fanciest piece of weapons tech in the game, the remote-controlled missile, a more tactical weapon typically employed to take out nastily located switches. Alongside your weapons, there's also plenty of inventory items to find around the base. There's plenty you'll expect, keycards for opening various doors, and rations for replenishing your health. Many of the other ones you'll find are more about getting through a particular section of the base, therefore using repeatedly, such as a parachute. But like the aforementioned cardboard box, there's body armour, gas masks and oxygen tanks, which are about helping you to survive in a hostile environment, more than getting the drop on enemy forces. In fact, for its time, I can't really think of any action-adventure games which had an inventory of this size. I think there's a reason why the advert I showed earlier was so darn effective to me back then. Controls are a mix of keyboard and joystick. The function keys let you pause the game, handle saving or loading, as well as accessing your transceiver and your separate inventories of weapons and items. Moving Snake around then is done with the cursor keys, with the spacebar to fire your weapon, and the N or M keys to punch. Though it's got to be said, having access to a 2-button MSX gamepad or joystick is really recommended here. It may sound unique to separate punching from firing a weapon, but it makes sense when you consider that using a non-silenced weapon will trigger the alarm. When that alarm goes off and those guards start hunting you down, it can become quite a battle to survive. Some cases, you're probably able to just clear the alert by getting to a safe screen. Other times though, you're out of luck. Survival is really down to dispatching a set number of guards. Though, with careful positioning and a bit of good tactical thinking, you can get through those waves of soldiers without too many problems. More importantly though are the hostages. Whilst it's not mentioned in your briefing, this is one of the more important tasks which you need to accomplish. Not only for getting karma points in rescuing trapped souls, but for every 5 you free, you'll level up in rank, which earns both extra energy, but also extra capacity for ammo and items in your inventory. And trust me, when you're nearing the closing stages of the game, you will be very thankful you rescued all the hostages you could. But they're also a great source of intelligence. Well, some of them are anyway. As you free them, some will offer information like transceiver frequencies for members of a resistance unit operating inside Outer Heaven. Others will offer pointers on what it takes to reach later sections of the base. Very handy things to note for when you're fleeing away from the enemy. With the good, there's also the bad, and in this case, that's the traps. Outer Heaven is filled with them, ranging from rooms filled with poisonous gas to others, where giant crushers roll back and forth. Or worse, hidden trapdoors and electrified floors. Some of these, it's all about being equipped with the right tools or weapons. Others, knowing the lay of the land. And yes, that's going to mean you experience sudden death on more than one occasion. When, not if, you happen to suffer this, you can continue from a game over, but this will throw you back at the nearest elevator. The elevators also serve as your save points, but this isn't a particularly simple process, as while disk drives were common on MSX2 spec computers, they weren't necessarily a required part of the standard. Which means, to save your progress, you need to dig up a cassette. I remember that being pretty painful when I was doing this in the 90s on an MSX emulator. In Space Year 2017, it's even less exciting a prospect to me now right now. But that's okay, because I did happen to have a workaround. Konami's Game Master 2 cartridge. Coming from the land of the action replay, I think a cartridge marketed by a vendor to provide cheat functions for their own games is kinda weird, but this works pretty well. Metal Gear support is really only for saving screen dumps, and also for making snapshots of gameplay. And the menu-driven interface for this works pretty well. Sure, the snapshots you make can't really be used on anything other than the machine you made them on. But when you just want to power through a game convenient, it works very well, and it's certainly not the end of the world. You've just got to really use Scouts on her and not be a save scummer, right? Metal Gear's narrative is not exceptionally complex. Let's face it, this is a 1987 release, with an influence in 80s action movies. It winds its way from focusing on searching for Grey Fox, to locating Metal Gear's creator, and ultimately learning its weaknesses. Because let's face it, any world-threatening superweapon just happens to have one of those. Of course, as unsurprising as it sounds, from that point it's all about getting to it within Outer Heaven's depths and finally taking the mechanical beast on, before getting out of dodge. During your adventure though, there's quite a few genuinely surprising moments. Moments that really blew me away the first time I encountered them, and ones which still happen to stick with me, even close to 20 years later. I greatly appreciate how restrained this whole story is, especially when looking at later installments of the franchise. None of the sequences really take all that long to get through, and the pacing feels far more natural. Yet, you can still see how these elements and the transceiver conversations could mutate and evolve into the grander cinematic style which would be frequently employed in the later games. Presentation-wise, graphics are very lovely on the hardware. They do a nice job of making a high-tech military base feel a bit fresh and unique, and actually quite a bit less drab than you would expect. Character sprites, weapons, all stand out very nicely here. Kind of cartoonish, but it still fits the game and its tone quite well. For the audio, Metal Gear is not a game which used Konami's SCC sound hardware. But for the stock MSX hardware, there is some outstandingly tense composition at work here. And honestly, I'm probably going to get a lot of downvotes for this, but the slower speed running on a PAL machine like I am actually works in its favour, with the slower music becoming far more tense and foreboding as a result. Now, whilst MSX owners were the first to play Metal Gear, they weren't the only ones. Truth be told, it really didn't do well in its initial release, and became far more popular, especially in the West, on its launch for a particular Grey Toaster a year later. That's the version that serves as the inspiration for the C64 version. Being a port of a port certainly doesn't make for a good start. If you know about that NES version, you'll know of the changes to the map, the gameplay, and certain other elements, like the lack of a certain titular superweapon. This C64 version was handled by Unlimited Software, better known as the porting arm of veteran developers Distinctive Software. In itself, that should sound like it's got some positive cred to start with, but it feels like their B team handled this one, much like their other conversions for Konami. The startup isn't too offensive. The disc loader, thankfully 64 Metal Gear was only released on disc, feels reasonably speedy, and the option to restore your game provides a major improvement over how the save system is employed on the MSX original. But from this opening, it goes downhill fast. Real fast. They start off an adapted version of the intro from the NES game, corrected to only just show one person jumping out of the plane this time. When you're on the ground though, that's when it really gets ugly. The colour schemes here are quite garish, and the sprites look, let's face it, ugly. Then, there's this droning music loop, lacking the tension or composition quality of that found in the MSX game. You get your call notification beeping in the status bar, and it's time to bring the transceiver up for your initial briefing. Switching to that kicks off a disc load. And when you're done, there's another disc load to get you back into the action. When it comes to accessing your weapons and infantry though, there's a small mercy, as whilst a disc load is required to present either of those screens, no further loading is needed once you've chosen a weapon or item. Even with a turbo loader, it still becomes painful in a very short period of time. Now, all those option screens are a real pain to access. Instead of borrowing what was done with the MSX, where you use a function key on each screen, pressing any of the function keys here brings up a selection menu much like the NES version. Use the joystick to select one, and then it's away for the loading. The plague, and I'll call it a plague, of loading doesn't really stop there. Each individual screen requires a disk load. Seriously. In 1990, whilst coders from Europe were compressing ridiculously large level maps into a single disk load, think of games like Turrican for example, requiring a disk access every single time you go and change screens drags the tedium from barely tolerable to infuriating on the absolute highest level. Not only that, but if you go in and out of a truck, once the scene reloads, the enemy placement here is likely going to push you right into a battle as soon as it's loaded. The clumsy controls extend into combat as well. Unlike the MSX, the C64 only has a single fire button on its joysticks, so to switch between weapons and your fists, you need to use the spacebar, with the fire button using that weapon. I'll be fair, it is as workable as it's going to get on the C64. It's a shame that the C64 GS standards never really took off, because you could have had dual fire buttons there. But eventually, you find your way through that hideous jungle section, get into building 1, and the map, slowly but surely, starts converging back with that of the original game. So, you go and evade those cameras, avoid the infamous roller crusher. Wait a minute. Was there a gap under that crusher? Yeah, seriously. The challenge with this screen was always about timing your movements to duck into the lower section of the screen as the crusher moves from side to side. It's a very nice little gameplay trick there. The fact that on this 64 version, the coders couldn't manage that, well, it's the first of many more signs of just how poor I think this conversion is. And I could go into a lot more of them, but I didn't get much further. In fact, the first power junction you need to use remote missiles to take out, I just couldn't hit it. You might think that that's just me being rubbish, but on the MSX version it was incredibly responsive, it behaved as it should, and there was no problem navigating it around the corridors. On the C64 version, the collision detection is so messed up, you truly require superhuman reflexes to successfully navigate it. And by this point in the game, I probably clocked up about an hour of playing. Whereas on the MSX, that was actually quite a good bit of progress. The fact that I hadn't even completed the first act of the game on the 64 because of all the disk loading and all the frustration really just wore me out. I was doing some reading on forums as part of my research, and I found that the 64 version was a really buggy conversion on top of that. There's tendencies to crash while you're fighting bosses, and I could have gone for a cracked version, as apparently removing the protection is enough to fix some of those bugs, but honestly, it was death by 1,000 cuts, and by this point of things, I just didn't really care to want to subject myself to this horrible attempt at a conversion. Now, let's try and just tidy things up and close out. In its original MSX form, Metal Gear, even after all this time, could still be truly considered a classic of the genre. Yes, even after 30 years. In working within the limitations of the platform, and scaling down a traditional action game, and introducing simplistic stealth mechanics, the result is something which is challenging, tense, and honestly, still quite a lot of fun, even with the slightly obtuse design from 1987. The story, as pared back as it may seem, is thrilling and tense in its own way, and I have to admit, I don't think I really miss the overblown elements that came later down the line in the more cinematic installations of the saga. As a C64 fan though, I'm truly disappointed to see just how bad the C64 conversion truly was. Sure, the C64 does have its limitations as a platform over the MSX, particularly the MSX2, and I am possibly being an idealist here, but I would like to believe that in the hands of the right crew, the C64 could still have been able to pull off an admirable take on the original game. But the heavy loading, the garish graphics, the painful music, all of these combine to create something which makes it absolutely a pain to experience. And that's just before you even experience the crashes and the other bugs which you'll encounter. I am really glad that as a 10-year-old I never actually saw this C64 version in action. I think it would have honestly turned me off what is an incredibly thrilling game, and a series which, despite that overblownness, is still one of those I really enjoy, all because of a rather lackluster conversion. While sitting down, playing it on a real MSX2 is truly the way you want to experience this game, but thankfully there are updated versions available, particularly via the Metal Gear Solid HD collection on the Xbox 360, PlayStation 3 and Vita. All of these feature some tweaks to line up the more recent entries, and contain an even nicer translation to boot. And with that, I think that really is everything I want to say about the original Metal Gear. I really hope you enjoyed this episode. Compared to many of the others I've done, this one took an amazing amount of work to pull off. And it would be great to hear your thoughts as always, particularly if you have played it. Please don't forget to leave a thumbs up, it does help out with getting the videos in front of more people. And of course, new gameplays and reviews come out on Fridays, so do hit the subscribe button if you want to check those out. And finally, if you also have the cash to spare, I do have a Patreon page open for these videos. Most of the time it's, doing my classic Let's Plays, but for bigger reviews like this, it does really go out to help out wonders. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll catch you all next time.